So I'm very pleased to have a second opportunity to present at the workshop. As I was corresponding with Anna about doing the first presentation on Monday, it came to her attention that there was also this other possibility, so she snagged me in for a second opportunity, and I'm very pleased to be here to do that. One of the nice things about being the second to the last on the agenda of the workshop is that I get to do a review and reinforcement. So most of what you see here in my presentation will not be new information. In fact, I must say that David's act just before lunch is going to be a hard one to follow. That was a very nice presentation. There'll be a few slides that will be somewhat, they'll be in common with the other one, with the earlier presentation, but I understand there are a few people that are here today that may not have been here on Monday. So what I'm going to be reporting today is an investigation undertaken by an entity at the University of Texas called the Energy Institute. The Energy Institute is serves as an umbrella organization that cuts across all of the colleges and research units within the University of Texas. So it's intended to reach across the various stovepipes, if you will. We've heard in earlier presentations about the different ways in which universities conduct research in energy-related issues. And this is the formula that we've hit upon at the University of Texas for the Energy Institute, to have interdisciplinary teams assembled to conduct state-of-the-art research in energy issues. And it includes the team members include not only the University in Austin, but other entities as well. And the idea is to assemble this expertise and have these teams develop white papers and then inform regulation development and energy policy making. And our mantra at the Energy Institute is good policy based on good science. So there are actually three initiatives underway at the Energy Institute at this time, and the one I'm going to be reporting to you today is specific to regulation development and informing regulations with respect to shale gas development. There are 4 areas that were covered in this study, as shown here, and so I'll be reporting these 4 areas to you this afternoon sequentially. We focused on the Barnett Shale in our backyard in Texas, the Haynesville, which is and the Marnella, and the Marcellus Shale. The report, the first edition of this report, came out in February of 2012, and we're in the process of completing the second edition, and we still hope to have it available before the end of 2012. This report was rolled out and announced at the AAAS meeting in February in Vancouver. There's a very interesting side story to this report, which I'm going to go over with you, and I want to save the side story until the very end. If you've heard the term fracademia, that will be the topic that I'll cover at the end. So how was the shale gas regulation project performed? Well, we wanted to undertake this study with internal funding, that is, without direct funding from the university in order to maintain objectivity. Again, we engaged interdisciplinary team members, and each team member developed a white paper that was then internally reviewed. Each white paper was internally reviewed among the various authors, what we called senior contributors. And then we had a rather formal external review by outside reviewers as well. Now, this was not intended to be or ever designed to be a full peer-reviewed publication, but rather a less formal form of external review by experts in the field of the respective areas, and the experts were actually selected by the senior contributors. So the review process was not did not meet the full standards of a full peer review, such as you would see for a journal publication. Then the white papers were integrated into a more of a policymaker oriented report. The report itself is about 420 pages long, and so what we did was compile a summary of findings, which was about 65 pages long, and that's that has all along been the primary document that we wanted to direct toward people who are developing regulations and who are making policy. So here's our interdisciplinary team. We had a number of schools and other entities. We had, during the planning phase, we had the Environmental Defense Fund involved, and then from Florida State University, actually the individual, as we'll see here in a minute, was actually at at Oklahoma State at the time that this work was done, and then she moved to Florida State. Well, most of these next few slides are going to be old hat toward the end of the workshop, and also somewhat redundant from my Monday presentation. But very quickly, South America stands in a very good position with respect to overall resource estimates. Top of the list as far as the continents of the world are concerned. This is a kind of also a tired slide by this time, but still nevertheless very important. 48 shale gas basins are targeted, likely to have shale gas, not all proven at this point, distributed throughout the world in 32 countries. This diagram is, again, we're quite familiar with now. The advent of shale gas and shale oil came about because of the application of existing technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, primarily by the good efforts of this individual. We all owe a great debt, in my opinion, to George Mitchell and his company, Mitchell Energy and Development Corporation, which was responsible for developing the application of these two technologies that has made it possible for us to have this tremendous boon in new energy source. And he did this in the Barnett Shale in the Fort Worth Basin near Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas. It took him about at least 10 to 15 years, started in 1981, and then he reaped the benefits when he sold his company in 2002. So let's return to the Barnett Shale just for a moment. This is an example again from my Monday presentation. The Barnett Shale is near Fort Worth, and what we're going to look at is the example from the University of Texas at Arlington, which is a sister university to the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm from. So we have a well pad, 22 wells, total of 110 billion cubic feet projected to be produced over the next 25 years. It's a development by Carrizo Oil and Gas. This is a picture of the well pad. You can see the university campus in the background, the brick buildings behind the well pad there. This is a photo taken from an airplane. And this is an aerial photograph looking directly down on the urban area around the University of Texas at Arlington, up here. And this is a footprint, I believe, of the land held by the university in the urban region between Dallas and Fort Worth in the city of Arlington. This diagram shows the location, or this air photo shows the location of the well pad here where the oval is. And again, another indication of the footprint. And then those are the 22 wells that are being drilled out from that one well pad. Okay, back to the basics. There are going to be 4 areas that I'll talk about, the way we put the team together for this particular study. We started with media coverage and how media coverage affected public perception, the environmental impacts, current regulations, and the enforcement of regulations. The first part was, the senior contributor was Matt Easton in the journalism department at the University of Texas at Austin. And when he did his research on the media coverage of the shale gas, he looked at these 5 types of media shown here. And the results were quite remarkable in terms of their uniform outcome. Almost all of the media were right in the same range of about 2/3 or 66% negative. So that was the tone of the media coverage, and that was pretty much true also for the 3 different shale gas areas that he looked at. In a separate effort but related, Matt Easton conducted an assessment of public perception through an online survey consisting of almost 1,500 respondents. This particular survey was focused in on the Barnett Shale because of the time and other resource constrictions. Had about 75 questions and looking at 3 primary areas. The news here was much better. There was generally an indication of positive responses for many of the questions that were included in the survey. But on the other side of the coin, the majority of the opinion was that hydraulic fracturing is bad for the environment and unsafe, perhaps reflecting the media coverage statistics. So I just wanted to very briefly show you what we accomplished in the study with respect to how the public was actually perceiving and how the media was covering the topic. Ian Duncan, who is a researcher at UT's Bureau of Economic Geology in the Jackson School, did the work on environmental impact evaluation. And here I have to tell you that with a 420-page report, there were many, many findings. And so what I'm going to be presenting to you today is just a very high-level touch on some of the more important ones that we pulled out for the presentation. Ian undertook a very ambitious approach, looking at not only the technical literature, but the online coverage, various websites, and addressing all phases of the shale gas life cycle. And the objective was to try to get a handle on the relationship between the claims that are made out in the blogosphere, if you will, and the scientific basis for those claims. Ian didn't just focus on one stage of the shale gas development life cycle, such as hydraulic fracturing, but he looked at all the stages from drill pad construction through the various stages shown here, and then some of the special topics along the way. So again, a very high-level view of the findings that Ian made as he reported in his white paper, and we consolidated into the summary of findings. Chemical additives, and by the way, I think that what you'll find, as I said at the start, that many of these findings are the same news that you've heard throughout this entire workshop. So we're having, I think, in the workshop a good, consistent identification of issues and the considerations that need to be made in dealing with the issues as Columbia moves forward into the future to develop the unconventional resources. Chemical additives may actually pose a higher risk when they're in their concentrated form at the surface where they're temporarily stored, say, in impoundments before injection, perhaps due to leakage or spillage or so forth. The disclosure of the chemicals, as we've seen, is increasing, and that's a very good thing to increase public confidence. Many of the chemicals that are in these fracturing fluids, as I think David Yoxtimer reported, provide a number of different functions, such as cleaning, biocides, reducing friction, and so forth. And these are chemicals that Ian made the point are very commonly used in our technological and industrial society. The same chemicals that are put into the hydraulic fracturing fluids, you may find many of them under your household sink, in your kitchen sink, is in the form of soaps or cleaners or biocides and so forth. And as a result, many of these chemicals are widely dispersed already in the environmental media. Now, Ian is quick to point out, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be adding to the load, if you will, in the environment. But the point is, I think that because chemicals are found in the environment, doesn't necessarily mean they can be attributed back to hydraulic fracturing and the chemical additives. Another story that we've heard very commonly throughout this and consistently throughout this workshop is the idea that the propagation of fractures upward from the fracture zone to the target gas shale or the oil or the shale oil, the shale containing oil and gas, the probability of that happening through that very thick sequence of geological strata is very unlikely, and there's been little or no evidence to date of the additives themselves in groundwater. Now, there have been a lot of other groundwater issues that have been identified, but insofar as the additives themselves being found in groundwater due to hydraulic fracturing, apparently there's little or no evidence to date. As again, we've heard throughout this workshop, methane is a naturally occurring substance, particularly in the area in the Northeast where the Marcellus occurs. There's been methane in water wells for decades. Many of the regulatory agencies or other state agencies have been putting out pamphlets for years to rural residents who have methane in their water wells, what to do about that and how to deal with it. Sometimes a lot of the claims that Ian found out in the on the web and elsewhere involve natural constituents like iron or manganese or turbidity that well owners claim is happening because of the shale gas development and hydraulic fracturing operations. Ian is himself apparently from Ian Duncan is from a rural area, and he notes the fact that in rural areas, if you have a water well that's been in service for a number of years, and then you do something to disturb that well, such as clean it or otherwise disturb it, that it'll turn cloudy or it'll actually turn red under normal circumstances of cleaning or otherwise dealing with the well. And his hypothesis, which he would like to test, is that when energy is introduced into the ground as a result of a rig operating or during hydraulic fracturing operations, that this vibration may actually be shaking the water wells and disturbing the buildup of bacteria and well, let's see, it would be primarily suspended matter that would be most noticeable. Another area that has emerged that Ian pointed out is, where does the burden of proof lie? And is it up to the operators to prove that they did not cause a problem? This is when you have a case where you don't have the baseline data, which we talked about at great extent in this workshop. Or is it up to the agencies to prove that the operators did cause it? Does the burden of proof lie on the owners that their well was damaged because of shale gas operations? And this is quite quite variable over the various shale gas areas in the states. Well, again, this is nothing new from our workshop. Surface blowouts, subsurface blowouts are issues that have to be planned for and dealt with good well completion practices and so forth. But as the industry has matured, we see that and the agency and regulations have gotten more stringent, that this is becoming a much more rare. Well, and I think also the point made earlier about the capacity of the various companies to ensure good practices is also resulting in an improvement of the situation. Well, water requirements we've already talked about. Has to be compared must be evaluated in comparison to other uses. This has been the competition for water supplies for hydraulic fracturing has become quite controversial in Texas, particularly in the last year or two because of the drought conditions. The Energy Institute has a second follow-on study that I won't have time to talk about today, but it's going to be a case study focusing on again on the Barnett Shale, and one of the things that we're looking at in detail is the relative value of water in its use for hydraulic fracturing versus other competing uses such as irrigation and municipal supplies. We have on our team for that follow-on study a couple of members from Texas A&M. Those of you that are familiar with Texas at all know that this is tremendous reaching out for the University of Texas to include our Texas A&M competitors in Texas. So there's a lot of intercollegiate rivalry between University of Texas and Texas A&M. So we feel quite proud of the fact that we've reached out and incorporated our Aggie brothers. Again, very consistent message. I'm not going to step through and read all of these points that are made at a high level for Ian's white paper findings. Air emissions and associated health effects. Most health effects are that have emerged so far, well, of course, there are the groundwater impacts and the concerns there, but many of the health effects are related to the air emissions. Ian's scope didn't necessarily include a detailed look into the climate change and greenhouse gas aspects of methane releases. He focused more on the constituents that were more of concern for health. VOC emissions in particular. VOC, volatile organic carbons, as you may know, are a smog precursor. They combine chemically with nitrogen oxides in the presence of sunlight to yield smog, particularly with ozone. And in the Barnett Shale area, in particular, and as well as Dallas, I believe, is under the Clean Air Act designated as an ozone non-attainment area. So ozone is and VOCs as a smog precursor is an issue of considerable concern in the Barnett Shale area. And again, we've heard a good deal about these other subjects, the sources of air emissions and how to go about doing green completions. As far as health effects, benzene, a known carcinogen, and other VOCs are again of primary concern, not only for as a smog precursor, but also for potential human health effects. The respirable quartz from mining operations for sand proppants is emerging as an issue. Particulate matter at 2.5 or below, 2.5 microns. And what Ian found is he looked into the health effects, as you might imagine, with shale gas and shale oil being, in particular shale gas being a new form of energy, relatively speaking. There is just not very much out there in terms of systematic studies of potential health effects. So what Ian found was that there have been a lot of attempts to transfer data from other types of facilities, such as refineries, chemical plants, and offshore conventional drilling. The third part, and actually the fourth part as well, as we'll see, was conducted by Hannah Wiseman, an environmental attorney. As I said, she's currently at Florida State. When we really were in the very early stages of the project, she was still visiting at the University of Texas. Then she went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then is now at Florida State. So this is kind of the scope of what Hannah Wiseman looked at. She looked at federal and state regulations, again, like Ian, examined the full cycle of well construction, and she included 16 states with current or pending shale gas production. Hannah looked at the life cycle, developed a little bit differently from the way that Ian did. One of the things we're doing in the next stage of the development of this report is to bring the two together so that we have an integrated presentation rather than just the summary of the white papers. Well, no news here again. There are a few federal regulations. There have been proposed regulations like the FRAC Act, but none have become law at this time, so that the coverage, environmental coverage from the federal standpoint, takes place under the mandate of various environmental laws in the United States, what we call the alphabet soup: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and all the rest. One of the aspects of shale gas and, well, oil and gas regulation in general at the federal level is that the oil industry over the years has enjoyed many exemptions from federal regulations. And these exemptions then have, by extension, been applied to shale gas operations as well. But there are federal regulations being developed for public lands, primarily in the western U.S. But a key finding, which you've also heard before, is that most of the regulatory authority for shale gas development comes along with general resource regulation in the United States. And in the split of powers, in the separation of powers in the U.S., there's the state, many of the powers are at the state level, and others are at the federal level. It's this dynamic tension between states' rights and federal primacy. And the way it's worked out historically with respect to resources, including oil and gas, is the states have come out on top for the most part. Again, generalizations of the findings. I won't lead you through them by the words here. Although there were many regulations on the books, many updates have been undertaken, as we've heard in previous presentations. At the time that Hannah was doing this work earlier this spring, the primary focus in the states was pretty much in these three areas: dealing with proper casing, avoidance of blowouts, disclosure of the fracturing solution contents. As David said, this has kind of been an issue of the past as the movement has been more and more toward disclosure, and we know what these chemicals are. And then the disposal, the management of the water that comes back, the flowback and produced water. One of the things that Hannah found was that there probably needs to be greater attention on surface events because of the publicity and the way the situation has evolved for shale gas development in the U.S. The emphasis has perhaps gotten too much focused on subsurface versus surface events. I think the operators in the room would certainly agree that it would be great if there was more consistency among the states in terms of covering various aspects of the shale gas development life cycle. Every state is a little different, Every state is organized differently, has different requirements, and so forth. And the good news is there are organizations that have already been brought out in this workshop. Groundwater Protection Council and the state regulations for oil and natural gas environmental regulations are stronger. So movements are afoot at the state level, and there are organizations, several others have been brought out by other presenters. These are just a couple of examples. One of the things that we found, and it's already again been brought out, is that local governments have been increasingly taking charge of their destiny, if you will. They are becoming very active and maybe in some cases feeling like they're filling the void where state regulations are still catching up, or they're concerned that they may never come. And we've already heard about the Dallas-Fort Worth area as being a prime example. In the follow-on study that I mentioned a minute ago, our Community and Regional Planning Department at the university is taking a very close look at the impact of local governments and their regulations on the shale gas development activities there. And the question of, between, of course, state governments gain their regulatory authority from the state level government, and so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out between the state and local governments over time. So it doesn't do any good to have a lot of regulations on the books, as we've heard, unless they're enforced. So Hannah took a close look at some of the states, I think 4 of the states of the 16, to try to gain an understanding of the capacity of the agencies in terms of the number of wells that are being developed in the state. We've heard that there's been an explosion, an exponential number of new shale gas wells in many of these states. So what's the number of wells? How many staff are available for conducting inspections? How many attorneys are available to proceed on violations and enforcement actions and so forth? And so here are the areas that Hannah looked at specifically in this study. Well, the first thing she found was it's hard to get data. Needless to say, these agencies are extremely busy writing permits, trying to write up notices of violation, enforcement actions, and when a university or other entity, and maybe you noticed that also, Dave Yacimientos, when you were getting the data for what are the agencies doing, they really don't want to take a lot of time to answer that question. A lot of times they don't have the capacity for good record keeping. And then there's the case like we have in Texas, for example, where you have more than one agency having regulatory responsibility. The primary regulator in Texas is called the Texas Railroad Commission, but a lot of the environmental regulations are also developed and enforced by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And when it comes to some aspects of regulations, such as naturally occurring radioactive material, you have a third agency, the Texas Department of Health, enters the picture. So again, it's this complexity on a state-by-state basis that makes it difficult for operators, and it made it difficult for Hannah to really get a handle, even on the 4 states that she focused on. Not surprisingly, the capacity that she found was highly variable in terms of the parameters that I just described. There's more quantitative information in extensive tables. By the way, Hannah also has extensive tables for the various phases of the shale gas life cycle that are somewhat similar to the ones that Dave Yacimientos presented in his presentation. There's probably on the order of 40 or so tables where for a particular issue it lists the states and then a kind of a brief summary of where they are and what is the regulatory citation that covers that area. General findings is shown here. Most states have some capacity. Many states are improving, and many of the violations that she found, it was hard to pick out the ones that were due directly to unconventional. that the enforcement and violations and enforcement activity wasn't necessarily broken out for unconventionals. So what she saw was that all kinds of violations that were not unique just to shale gas. One of the big findings was the tendency of the regulators to focus on procedural rather than substantive effects. Surface spills, improper disposal of oil and gas, and others relatively common, as kind of a separate finding, many of the violations or enforcement actions had to do with very kind of elementary operational parameters, relatively common, and they're easily prevented. So really two separate findings, the tendency of the regulators to focus on the readily visible and perhaps the less substantive findings. I think we'll have a table to show that again in a minute. Very few of the violations that were noted were in response to complaints. That is, if a regulatory agency received a complaint from somebody living near a well pad, there were very few that were followed up on with violations. Almost all the violations that were noted were due to regulatory inspections by agency staff. And the actual number of enforcement actions are very sparse. I think one of the points we heard earlier is that there's some grumbling, but the operators, when they receive an NOV, a notice of violation, will generally, and particularly in Texas, the stance of the regulatory agency is to say, hey, here's a notice of violation, and then they give you a fairly ample opportunity to respond to the violation before it goes all the way to a formal enforcement action. Well, I made the point earlier that there tended to be a greater emphasis on procedural or violations that have not very much environmental effect. And when you get up into the substantial or the major violations, they tended to be relatively few in number in comparison. Okay, well, a very brief summary. Again, what we did in the study, the media part, media coverage, public perception part, environmental impacts, and then what are the regulations on the books, and what is the capacity of the various states to enforce those regulations. And just at a very high level, I would say it's fair to say that there's a disconnect in many of these areas between what's known in the science and what is the perception on the part of the public, or even what's available or what's actually taken advantage of in the development of regulations. I think everybody realizes that we still have work to do in the U.S. and elsewhere to bridge the gap between what's known in science and engineering and what's actually reflected in the regulations. And many of the claims that are out there on the internet appear not to be based on science. We've had a lot of discussion about the Gasland movie, for example. So that's the main part of the presentation. I'm going to leave that up and then address the other question that I promised at the beginning, which is kind of an interesting side note for this particular study. The principal investigator for the study, the guy who hired me in to be kind of the project manager, was the former head of the U.S. Geological Survey. His name is Chip Grote, Charles Grote, and he, like many other professors in academia, has outside interests. Many academicians have received grants. That's how they fund their studies and so forth. In the case of Chip Grote, he was actually on the board of directors of an energy company engaged in shale gas development operations. And when this came to light, there was a lot of controversy about this study. Chip Grote has indicated in retrospect, yes, he should have disclosed this. And so he's been taken to great task and has indicated that, yep, in hindsight, it would have been a better idea. The University of Texas has changed and revised its conflict of interest regulations. In fact, that was a movement that was already underway. Dr. Grote was not in violation of any university regulation. Primarily from the standpoint of this was a totally internally funded project that with internal Energy Institute funds. And furthermore, I think by bringing me on the scene, he intended to get some distance so that there would not be the opportunity for inappropriate influence on the report. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that from an appearance standpoint, it was not a good thing. And there has been, as I say, a lot of controversy about this. One of the first questions that came up when this came to light in July of this year was, did Dr. Grote have any inappropriate influence on this report? And so the university provost and the director of the Energy Institute came out and said, we're going to have an independent panel examine the report and they will tell us whether there has been undue or inappropriate influence by the PI, the principal investigator. So the panel convened in August, and just in late November came out with a draft report. And the draft report says in 2 or 3 areas inside the draft that there was no inappropriate influence. So in that sense, the report is exonerated, if you will, from undue influence by a principal investigator having university ties. Having energy industry ties. We're still, I think the final report has come in. I understand it hasn't really changed very much, so that basic finding will be unchanged. But there are some other issues that have come out in the review panel's deliberations that the university is still, I think it's fair to say, is still wrestling with. So the university hasn't yet come out with its response to the panel report. But I wanted to let you know about this controversy, not only to let you know that there has been some controversy around the study, but also as kind of an object lesson for university researchers. It's almost like we're the one of several in the country examples where in highly controversial areas like shale gas, there is, and where there's a lot of anti-development organizations and feeling and sentiment, that you really have to go the extra mile beyond what was conventionally accepted in terms of research scientists and their clients and the objectivity of research. So in that sense, I guess we can say we're the poster child for future university researchers in highly controversial areas like shale gas development. We feel very good about the preliminary findings of the review panel. Of course, as the co-principal investigator and de facto project manager, I knew all along there wasn't any influence, right? But having the review panel verify that, at least in their draft report, was very gratifying and kind of, in a way, exonerating the report. So a lesson to be learned there. Let us be the poster child. Don't repeat the same kind of situation. So if that all ended, I think I'm still within time. So, okay.